We're going to start off. We are very fortunate today to have Linda McDonough here. As restructuring professionals, we oftentimes focus on the transaction, the loan, our clients' uh, ability to sell its assets, reorganize, whatever law that you're operating under. But one of the important things in a small case and in a large case is making sure you manage the message that you're sending out to the various constituencies, whether that's your customers, your employees, in a retail case, maybe it's your landlords. So Linda's going to talk to us for a few minutes today. Linda is the managing director at 50 Words LLC, and she helps clients with communication strategy and marketing challenges. She has particular depth working across financial services, professional services, and healthcare industries, but she draws upon a variety of cross-industry experience as well. She's a trusted advisor who has guided messaging and communication programs for clients in crisis situations, helping them to strengthen their stakeholder confidence and preserve value. Linda's very active in the restructuring community. She's the former president of the Philadelphia chapter of the Turnaround Management Association, and she's on the board of the Philadelphia Network for the International Women's Insolvency and Restructuring Confederation, among other titles that she holds. She has an MBA and a bachelor's degree from St. Joseph's University in Philadelphia. And with that, Linda, I would turn it over to you so we can hear a little bit about communication strategy.
Sure. Thanks, Ray. Thanks, everyone. It's nice to meet everyone on this brisk morning. Thanks for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit today about crisis communications, and marketing will enter into it a little bit in the conversation. I'm going to share this presentation with everyone. Let me see. Can you see my screen? Yep.
Yes, we're good.
Okay, excellent. As Ray mentioned, by background, my firm is a boutique, a smaller firm located outside Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, in the United States. Prior to founding 50 Words, I was with the global brand Textron, where I led a team of strategy, communications, and marketing professionals. But a lot of my practice today is really concentrated in one of three areas: either crisis communications, also known as strategic communications, public relations, and marketing. So regardless of the size, I think the things with some takeaways today are regardless of the size of your client, regardless of where in the world the matter occurs, the legal matter occurs, I think that we're going to talk about just some universal things to think about when your client is involved in a corporate restructuring or bankruptcy situation as it pertains to communications. So there is some uniqueness about strategic communications and crisis communications as it relates to these types of matters. And really, it's because the crisis life cycle is generally longer. That's the first thing. The second thing is it impacts a greater number of stakeholders. And the last thing is often those stakeholders have competing interest. And it's really important to be thinking about that sort of as you're managing through one of these situations and the communications. So typically in another crisis situation that isn't this type of a matter, you're really trying to have it only be out in the market, in the media, maybe one news cycle, two news cycles. What tends to happen with these corporate restructuring is they're in the news for a longer period of time. There's a lot of conversation in the marketplace with different shareholders or stakeholders about what's happening. And what you're really trying to do is control that through the process. So you have this pre-crisis process, which depending upon when you're engaged and other professionals are engaged, and if there are communication professionals engaged, sometimes that pre-crisis could be, hey, we have a client and, we're going to file this week, or, we're going to enter into some sort of an event, a trigger event that creates a need for a cascading set of communication. So what typically happens is that that period is very truncated, unless you have, that something's maybe been going on for months with professionals leading up to it, but often we don't have that luxury. Then there's the situation where you actually have the announcement or the crisis has occurred. And then you have this period, which is the majority of the time of the engagement, where you have this period of escalation, de-escalation. So there's new issues that arise. And then those issues resolve themselves. And then there's a little bit of a circling back, and you sort of have new items that are hitting the news. And throughout all of these, or just even if it doesn't hit the local media or the national media, it could just be that you're communicating out to your various stakeholder groups, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then there's this period afterwards where you have this post-crisis period that you still need to be preserving brand value and making sure that you continue to communicate with these groups. And that could be 3 months, 6 months, a year, 2 years. So you just have this very long period that you need to be managing communications through. And it really is unique to corporate restructuring and bankruptcy situations. So let's talk a few minutes about sort of setting the strategy. So I often say this is the most important part, is defining the issues. So sometimes when we get brought into crisis communications, we're dealing with the client themselves. And sometimes there may be situations where the client isn't, being forthright about all the issues that have occurred, or maybe, they try to sugarcoat it a little bit. So because they want the story to be told in a certain way. It's very important when you're setting a communication strategy to really have a clear understanding of what's transpired. And that's sort of on the circular, on this diagram, maybe it's even mousing around. That's what's really going on here in defining issues. So a lot of times in these engagements, again, we talked about, you have this very truncated period to be able to define those issues. But often I find that I'm working probably the closest with counsel, with their attorneys, because they've already maybe put together a narrative, or with them, I can really understand the bigger picture of what's happened that led to this event. And then the second part, which we'll talk about in a minute, is just these various stakeholders, determining who they are and how we're going to reach them. Then from there, you start creating all these different communications. So you could be talking about, helping them with creating just media outreach. It could be that, you're creating materials for them to send to all their staff, and there might be unions involved. There's all sorts of things that are happening. So really, if you mess up on steps 1 and 2, you'll find yourself creating all these communications that really aren't reflective of the situation. And then you're going to have to sort of restart the whole process again. So it's important, excuse me, it's important to really get steps 1 and 2 right. And then steps 3, 4, and 5 become a lot easier. Just creating the communications, executing on the timeline, and then, of course, monitoring and measuring what's going on. And there's tools that can be used to do that if you're thinking about maybe what's being said in traditional media, in news outlets, on social media, where more of the conversations occur. So it's very important, again, to understand at the beginning with the client, with their financial professionals, with their legal professionals, to understand what the desired outcome is. So what is it that we're trying to do? Are we trying to preserve a brand and an asset? Are we trying to really just get an organization and figure out how to manage it through a sale process? Are we trying to figure out, how to manage it until they get the right funding in place to recapitalize the company. And really, during that time, you're reassuring their key audiences, those stakeholders that matter most to that organization. Sometimes you're restoring the public's confidence in that brand, depending upon what it is. I know Brian mentioned at the beginning, maybe there's retail situations or things. So sometimes you're encouraging consumers to feel comfortable purchasing from a brand. And then you're really just trying to limit adverse publicity. And that's in the media, but you're also trying to limit adverse conversations happening about the brand behind the scenes, maybe in vendor circles, at industry conferences, for their customers, in employee staff meetings, because certainly we don't want a defection of large amounts of employees during this process as well. So let's think about like stakeholders. So again, in these bankruptcy and corporate restructuring engagements, typically there's a lot of stakeholders. So I have some major stakeholder groups on this slide, but there could be dozens more. And often they have competing interest, and often they're very vocal about what they want to, how they want to be communicated with, and what they're hearing. So the stakeholder groups at the very beginning of the engagement, whether you're working directly with the client and they have internal folks that are doing this, or there's an external communications firm that you brought in to help with this work, taking the time to understand and list out all these groups at a time when I know there's a lot of other things going on that are equally important, but understanding like, who are the investors and shareholders? Who are those key groups within, or those key individuals within any of these categories? Who are your employees? Who are members of your leadership team? Understanding who your contractors and subcontractors are, who your customers, and especially as you look at your creditors and your vendors and suppliers, really getting a full list of who they are, and then bifurcating that list into who's key, who's critical suppliers, who's our key customers. Because when you design your communication strategy and your outreach to each, you're going to want to understand, like, how am I going to be able to communicate to these folks? So if you have a small number of investors or a small number of board members in smaller companies, it becomes more, well, we're going to pick up the phone, we're going to call them. But when you get into customers or clients that have hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, depending upon the size of the company, even small companies can sometimes have a lot of customers and vendors and suppliers. It's really important to put together this list. So you can imagine it's a spreadsheet, it's some other sort of tool, but you have each of the categories, you have the individuals, and then you start thinking about sort of visualizing this from left to right, where how am I going to reach them? Do I have those lists? Do I have email addresses? Do I have phone numbers? And a lot of times, as we started to talk about at the beginning, what makes these engagements unique is you have this very truncated period, right? You have this very short period to be able to gather a lot of information. And what's happening internally is, if an announcement hasn't been made internally, you're having to go to folks that don't understand who you are, why you're asking for this information. So it becomes problematic. It's very common that as these engagements unfold, that someone says, oh, I forgot to tell you, there was this person that needed to be notified. You really want to try to identify who these folks are. And then, because as you're thinking about the communications that you're creating for them, whether they're emails or their phone messages or their whatever form they're going to take, letters, whatever those things are, you just want to make sure that, okay, do we have everyone down in the middle of a crisis that we can think about? Another important part is spokespersons training. So often when people think about spokespersons, they're thinking about that public face of that company. And it's very important when there are these types of situations to make sure that you land on the right folks that are able to communicate messages during a crisis. So that might be the CEO, that might be, there could be a chief restructuring officer in there, there could be a chief financial officer. it's really, pride has to sort of step aside during these situations. And I know ego sometimes, it's really figuring out who best can deliver the message on behalf of the organization, who's going to be able to um, really sift through and understand the important parts. We give them, typically when we start creating the narrative in the background, we'll give folks key messages, and then there's messages that sort of cascade from those messages depending upon who the stakeholders you're communicating to. But often in organizations, people think of the main face that they see, maybe in the media or in other sorts of communications. But behind the scenes, there might be a handful of other folks that are helping us communicate. It might be an HR leader who's really going to be tasked on that day of that event that it's being announced. You might say, okay, well, the CEO is going to be here being interviewed. We're going to have at the same time the HR managers or HR leaders cascading messages down to employees. We're going to have sales managers and sales leaders talking to key customers. And maybe at the same time, we're hitting send on a message to all the other customers by email until we can get, have conversations can be held with them if appropriate. Same thing on the supply chain side. You might be talking about a buyer or someone who heads a supply chain for an organization. And smaller companies might not have all these defined roles. This might all be, many of these things might be handled by one or two people. So we have to think about, as we put together who we're communicating, how we're communicating, when we're communicating, what's going to be that cascading set of communications, understanding who we can use in the organization. And often these folks, the CEO, the CFO, they're going to know what's going on, but maybe that next level down in the organization isn't aware of the situation or understanding what's going to happen. So when you're asking people to communicate during a crisis, when they're impacted by a crisis, you have to think about that and sort of how you train them and who you select and who's going to be able to deliver messages at the same time that they're going through whatever situation there is. Investor relations become very important. Lender relations become very important. Just keeping them up to date, because cash is king. We need to make sure money's flowing in. Customers, we need to make sure they continue to pay us during this process. So, having that cash flow for the business is important, and vendors understanding sort of where they stand with the balances that are owed to them and whether they're willing or able to perform any other services. So a lot of times, especially with middle market companies or small, lower end middle market companies, those companies, you're a lot of time having to play this role of educating their vendors, their customers, because maybe they haven't been through this. Bigger companies and bigger vendors, bigger customers, they sort of have their own playbook for as these situations unfold, but smaller firms don't. So there's a lot of educating that has to be happening at the same time. So that brings us to choosing the right folks for communications. So when one of these situations happened, just the same why they engage all of you as their attorneys, that's not the time to sort of learn, what's happening, because you've got to be responsive. You're trying to preserve a brand, the value of a brand. So that's not really the time for on-the-job learning. A lot of times in these organizations, because they are going into a restructuring, they may be thinly staffed in their communications department, or they might be too close to the situation to be able to communicate it properly. So what you'll do is you'll bolster their internal comms teams, and bring in professionals to help the company just weather this process. When you're thinking about a firm, it's important to understand if they have in-country or local expertise, or if they have a global knowledge and footprint.
Gumpata, Happy.
I'm sorry, did I miss a question?
No, I think there was a sort of internal discussion in Kenya.
Oh, okay.
So I've just muted Benson. It's the 21st century. It's kind of you know, it's life on Zoom.
Right. I just want to make sure I didn't miss something. So understanding like these industry nuances, whether the communications professional should have public, private, or nonprofit sector experience, the same reasons why they engage any professionals. You need to think about choosing the right communications professionals to help them, and also sort of making sure they're the appropriate size. So larger, if you have a very large global client that needs boots on the ground and multiple companies, then you're going to go to one of the larger communications firms. If you have middle market company, you might look for someone that's more local, but maybe they have expertise in specific areas. Maybe there's labor issues, maybe there's investor relation issues, maybe there's some criminal pieces to what led up to the filing or what led up to the communication. So they might need to have that sort of background. How strong are their media training skills? What sort of programs do they have in place to be able to quickly train spokespersons? And then, do they have a background in public affairs? So these are some of the things to think about in choosing the right firm for your client. And again, I don't think I can underestimate enough the importance of legal counsel working with the communications team and being able to respond to them quickly. So typically in these engagements, once we come up with key messages, legal's approving off on them. And then once we create all the various communications, legal is approving off on them in real time. So if I'm sending them, okay, I have this email I'm going to send out, I have this letter I'm going to send out, here's something I'm responding to the media, I need to get back to them, they're on deadline, and I need to get back to them by, in an hour. Here's the statement that we're going to send out. Legal's counsel's working very closely with these firms. It's not like they're the communications firms out doing its own thing and legal's doing something else. This is really part of the strategy that's been determined for the company to help get them from point A to point B. And all the communications folks need to be working alongside the other professionals in the matter. So typically the sort of services these communications firms are going to have, they do everything from risk assessments to crisis plans. They do crisis response manuals. I mean, ideally, when you're walking into a client, this isn't the reality, but ideally, clients should have sort of a playbook, a crisis communications playbook already in design, where they have identified all their stakeholder groups, where they have identified canned responses, statements, holding statements, we call them, to media inquiries if a certain situation occurred. Generally, regardless, once a company sort of moves out of what I consider a small business into a lower middle market company, they should have a playbook and they should rehearse this. They don't, but that's ideally what should happen. So when a company experiences a situation, whether it's a bankruptcy, it's a corporate restructuring, whatever the situation, they're sort of ready and they can react appropriately, for whatever's affecting their business. These companies, strategic communication firms, today we have a lot more tools at our disposal, media monitoring services. So there's Cision, there's Meltwater, there's all sorts of brands out there that provide media monitoring. So an additional expense that a company will typically incur, if it's not just part of the fee from the strategic communications firm, is sort of media monitoring services as well. And there's tools out there that can help companies sort of repair their brands, and the leaders of these companies repair their brands after they go through a situation. It's just how you manage it and help them manage it. So I'm going to pause there, and I'll stop sharing. Keith, unless, how do you want to Ray, how do you typically handle questions?
I have some questions. And
Okay.
what I normally do is, because no attorney really likes to be the first to ask a question, I get in and ask the dumb questions, and then the smart attorneys in the room go, the dumb guys asked a question. I can ask an intelligent question now. This is how we play it. So I love the fact that you say what should happen is as firms start on their growth trajectory from small to sort of significant, SMEs, small to medium sized, they should really have a crisis comms in place. But I also love the fact that you go, never happens.
Right.
So typically, at what stage of the process do you come in, and what do you find? What is that?
So
what is that reality?
So I think it's typically right before, like sometimes it'll be someone, they're working through the strategic options for their client, right? What they're going to do. Are they going to follow? Are they going to, how's the reorganization going to happen? So typically I get brought in very close to when this announcement needs to get made. So that's why it's so imperative to really sometimes, and there's just this natural proclivity. People they don't want something to be out there that's bad about their firm, even though they're facing the reality of what's about to be announced. They're trying to sugarcoat it, like I was saying, in a nice way. But that's not the time for that, because we're in this very time compressed period, and a lot has to happen. You've got to figure out what those messages are. Like, again, in that circle, you've got to figure out who my stakeholders are. You've got to figure out, how am I going to communicate to these folks? What's the timeline going to be? What's the platform that I'm going to use? Who's going to communicate it? What training they have in sort of communicating this? So a lot of times I'm brought in, ideally it would be a month before or something like that, but sometimes it could be weeks or days. Sometimes it could be someone's, all of a sudden they realize they have a situation and they didn't bring in anyone. An announcement sort of has already taken place in the marketplace, and then they're trying to control the message. And so then, you're just trying to play catch up and to really diffuse whatever is out there. And a lot of, just because the way people communicate today is so different, I can prepare all the communications in the world. I can say, okay, let's do a town hall meeting with your staff. 30 seconds into that call, your staff is already communicating. They're not even really paying attention to the communications that we've developed so far. They're already texting each other, talking to each other. There's side conversations going on. So this sort of understanding how quickly communications have to happen. They could be reaching out to the media. So there's situations, communications folks, we talk about it, like, I have to assume that that first communication will be in the hands of the media within minutes, if not hours. So anything that you put out, that's why it's so important to work alongside legal counsel. You need to make sure that anything that goes out there, if it falls into someone else's hands, that, it's okay that happens. And that's why you want your messaging to be so on point across these different groups. But today it's, your customer will know. So, before we could say, okay, we're going to start cascading messaging at, 10 a.m., 9 a.m., whatever it is. So the first group we're going to talk to our senior leaders. Then they're going to talk to staff. They're going to start calling people. They're going to start do all these things. But that period is shrinking more and more with each engagement. So I hope, Keith, I answered that question.
So one of your key skills then is the ability to scramble.
Yeah. And to make sure that team, like, that you have in there with you, can scramble. So you can imagine, someone's filing, or they're in negotiations with their lenders, whatever those things that are happening. I need that legal counsel to also be ready for me to be like, I need you to look at this now. Like I know you have all these other things going on, but I need you to look at this at the same time. And everyone sort of has to understand that those first days are critical. And then sort of as these issues arise, it's really good for counsel or whoever, they know something else is coming down the road. Then you usually have a little more time. They might say, okay, this might happen today. And then you can sort of, but you still have to then communicate again to all those groups, depending upon what, whatever that is. Or if you do a good job in your initial communications, you can sort of anticipate what some of those things are and say, you are going to hear other things about this brand or this company. But it's really just, for even clients that say, well, I can't afford communications folks, I can't afford whatever, they need to be going through this process regardless. We've seen in the United States, I know there's been a movement sometimes just the same as law firms have government relations folks in-house. They've started to bring communication teams in-house and have that as an additional revenue stream because they know that they need to be working alongside those folks. I mean, can some of the things be the same from engagement to engagement? Sure, some of the messaging can, but some, there's often a uniqueness to the situation. And you can also have key defections that happen during that first week, whatever, where all of a sudden, one of your top folks leaves. And then you're trying to figure out, well, what's the impact of that going to be on our business? And how do we make sure that we don't have other employees jettison the company going out the door? And what are they saying as they're leaving? So.
And you've touched on it. Communication nowadays is so fast and so fragmented.
Right.
There is an argument that crisis comms was always a good thing. It's always like extra insurance. And now if you want to get on top of the wildfire, you really need to not just move fast, but it's interesting your list of all the people involved, because I've experienced organizations where they've put together the messaging to go out to the world, to go out to the media, and then completely forgotten not only staff and employees, but vendors, suppliers,
yeah,
you name it.
Again, so part of this is also having a ranking of those stakeholders, Keith, right? So it's, for some people, the media might be the most important. For others, the media might be number 10 on the list, right? So if I can keep the trust of these key clients, that's how my brand's going to survive. So it goes back to those original goals. What are we trying to achieve? Are we trying to get a business from this point to be sold? Are we trying to sell a certain subsidiary? Who are we willing sometimes to muddy up the waters with in like the whole brand and maybe try to keep other ones out of the fray? So it's if there's multiple pieces to the organization, it's really sort of getting that understanding. But sometimes the media waits. I mean, I've been in engagements and someone will reach out and say, well, I need I'm on deadline. I need to quote by this time. Well, okay. But it's more important for us at that very minute to be communicating with vendors or something. And you're not going to have the size team that you need, but there's a lot of monitoring that's happening and sort of sometimes adjusting our message real time, if something else maybe has occurred or something with the situation. So that's what I'm saying, to bring the communications folks in, it's sometimes better to bring them in early. And it's also, a lot of this is a function of how close-lipped they are in the organization themselves. So sometimes the CEO, their leadership team knows. Sometimes the owners of the business, they tell no one outside the family until whatever news is going to breaks. That's why it becomes, you're trying to get them to say, well, okay, I need, all these stakeholders, and I need to know, do you have lists? And are we going to have email addresses? Are we going to have phone numbers? A lot of times, Keith, they'll say to me, we're going to email everyone. And then when we go to hit email, no one has the list. No one has any email addresses. We don't have email addresses for our vendors. So it's sort of understanding that as well.
Final question, and then hey, other people can play. Your relationship then with attorneys, do you tend to be brought in by the organization itself and then have to sort of create that, who are your lawyers, and then build that relationship very, very quickly? Or does it tend to be the other way around, that sort of legal counsel have said, look, hey, client, we know this crisis comms management, cluster management people who are brilliant. You need to work with them to help us smooth this through. How does it work generally?
It's more the latter, this situation you just described, where I'm I already know counsel, maybe I've worked with them in prior engagement, and the same with other strategic communications firms. They usually know legal counsel. They might know the financial advisors that are in there, or if there's a chief restructuring officer, they may have worked with them before. So it's usually, the people. So they sort of understand your process, and you understand sort of what what you can expect from them.
Great. Thank you. I know Ray has questions, but, Yannick, Benson, Sean, Andrew, Fiona, please, either raise a hand or jump in, but over to you, Ray.
Sure. Just to echo kind of what we just talked about, and I know Linda knows this, one of the most important things if you're working on a decent size engagement is the law firm ideally will have a point person at the firm. It's not somebody different every time, but a point person at the firm that is able to interact with the crisis communication specialist so that they can get back to the media on a 1 hour time frame. So, somebody like Linda is not scrambling, to find somebody at the law firm to be able to sign off on the message that's going to be delivered. So yes, the relationships do have to be there.
I don't know if anyone else can talk about, I don't know, Ray, I'm sorry for interrupting. If anyone on the phone has used crisis communications folks in their engagements.
I certainly have. I've been the point person for the PR firm's messaging, whether it's to the employees, whether it's to customers, whether it's to the media, whoever it might be. I've been the point person that has to sign off on the message that's being delivered. And I don't think, I know Linda said, you can't underestimate how important this can be. You can have the most wonderful loan transaction, the most wonderful sales transaction, have your reorganization plan, but if you're not messaging that correctly to your various constituencies, whoever's important in that case, it won't go as smoothly. At best, it won't go as smoothly. At worst, it's a failure. And I can actually give you Linda, you mentioned before, and it's something I never really thought of before, that distress, insolvency type of situations oftentimes are in a longer period in the news cycle. It's not that you're just dropping bad news on Friday at 4 o'clock, hopefully before a holiday weekend, or conversely, if you have good news, maybe you're emerging from bankruptcy of new financing, you're trying to do it on Monday at 9 o'clock when the market's open, whatever. So I think it becomes, because it's days, weeks, months of messaging, it's even more important to get it right. And one of the ones that I've seen recently, just for a real example, here in the United States, a company by the name of Yellow Trucking filed for bankruptcy late last year. They were the largest less than a truckload trucking company here in the US. And they were in negotiations with their union over wages and benefits, and they didn't reach an agreement. And they just pulled the plug on thousands and thousands of jobs. And what was critically important was the messaging that they were sending at the beginning. Whereas the company was clearly blaming the union was blaming incompetent management. And they were fighting this, not only the lawyers in the court filings, but also in all the news articles you saw where, whoever it was, John Doe, CEO of the company, is quoted as saying, if union was just more reasonable, this never would have happened. Whereas, Jane Doe, head of the unions, is being quoted as saying management's had years to turn this around and it's just incompetent. So that I thought was critically important. I really never focused on that before, Linda, that it is more than one news cycle.
Oh yeah, it could be. And from when you have an adverse event, you want it to be one, right? You want it to be one and done. Sometimes I'll discourage clients from actively engaging with the media, because we want it to be done, right? But and what we think the likelihood of that happening is, sometimes there's other more pressing news, but in the matter that you just referenced, that people got very bloody in the media. Like, everyone had their teams out there, so you've got to be monitoring that and understanding what people are saying. So I think that's the other important part, especially if there's some sort of ongoing litigation or negotiations. Sometimes I'm saying to my clients, I'm seeing these comments on, say it isn't a bankruptcy matter, say it's a union negotiation matter. Sometimes I'm saying to them, okay, here's what I'm seeing on social media. So, understanding, going to the rallies, the union rallies, to hear what people are saying, because that's going to they're shaping those messages there locally, with their members. But sometimes I'm funneling that information over to counsel too, to say, hey, this is what's out there, this is what's being said, and that might shape or redefine what their approach is.
Yeah, my experience has been that the CRO is really driving the bus. So the CRO will control the message, and frankly hire someone like Linda and whatnot as an attorney, right? We're conservative, so we take a look at everything before it goes out. And naturally, we want to go ahead and cut back a lot of flowery language and whatnot, not give the other side any purchase to use against us in the future. I have to confess, I've not been, lead counsel or involved in a case like Yellow. I mean, we are involved in Yellow, but in a very sort of tertiary way, like for a landlord and whatnot. But yeah, I mean, our experience has always been sort of a secondary role, that we're not out in front of that, because I've always been trained never to try a case, or never to try your case in a court of public opinion. Now, sometimes in a liquidation, excuse me, clients want to get information out because they want to sell assets, right? You still have an operating company, you still have cash flow, you want things to, you want a marketplace to develop, and presumptively an auction for your assets and whatnot, but that's a very careful needle to thread. Because at one point, right, you broadcast this and all of a sudden your customers flee, your account debtors stop paying you, which creates cash flow issues. So it's a very sort of delicate balance. Normally I've seen that sort of broadcast happen at the moment of that inflection point of either the assignment to the benefit of creditors, or bankruptcy filing, as the case may be, or if it's a sort of CRO/board orchestrated liquidation and whatnot. Once that decision has been made, the point of no return, then you can go out into the marketplace and stuff like that. But again, in that situation where you're really trying to sell either valuable assets or a more important, a going concern, very difficult, right? Everything's got to be in place before the message goes out.
Yep. But Sean, the situation that you just mentioned, sometimes you don't want to, I mean, we never want to be trying a matter in the, out in the media. I don't think any media if someone comes to you and say that's where the best place to have these conversations, all we're trying to do is influence perception and make sure our message is being told, because if we don't tell it, other folks are going to tell it for us. So we're better off arming them with the message that we want to be told. And then figuring those things out. Like, again, there might be situations where we don't respond to every media request. We might not feel that there's a benefit for us. If you are liquidating something, it's really working closely alongside your marketing professionals to understand what the liquidation plan is. And again, making sure those messages get out there.
And Linda, as you say, internally so important.
Oh yeah.
So much of the focus tends to be external,
right.
And then the employees get forgotten, and then either they stumble out and say something, or they become resentful and say something.
Right.
And then suddenly you're fighting a fire it was right underneath you. You started and you didn't need to.
you just have to remember everyone's acting in self-interest, right? So if I'm an employee, I want to know, do I have a job? Am I going to be able to pay my bills, my mortgage, my kids' education, my car loan, whatever, my food bill, whatever those things are, those fear. I mean, that's just the reality. They're going through that situation at the same time. So it's really getting those other, like, we don't want to have all of our communications. We want to make sure they're the right spokespersons, but we don't want it to all flow through one person, because what's going to happen is, if I can't trust my HR leaders or someone to be responsible to be communicating with staff, we want them to be bringing us questions, and the other important thing, even if it's a manual process, is understanding, tracking what questions are being asked. So for any of your spokespersons, they should be recording. If you, just the same as if we have a call log for media inquiries, anytime there's a vendor meeting, those conversations need to, that information needs to be flowing back up through the organization. Who did you speak with? What were the main points? Do we owe them back some sort of a response? So that process, and some of these things can be very quick. Maybe you're in and out of bankruptcy, or maybe again you shift. These are our initial messages about that we just got new financing in place, but then we want to shift, right? Maybe it's not so much about the financing, but maybe it's showing what we're doing. Maybe we've hired some new folks, maybe we've expanded our product or service line. And that's what I'm saying, all these pieces start to fit. So you have this very long cycle, and you just need to make sure that you're consistent and you're not tripping over messages that you put out in the past that were erroneous, they were false, or maybe, I mean, it's okay if something changes, but you don't want to intentionally say the wrong thing out of the gate, or not be transparent and then have to try to walk back statements. That's near impossible to do.
The other point I wanted to make, and I asked Linda to focus more on the insolvency restructuring type of area, because that's our group, but communication strategies can be brought in many different areas. I mean, a company could have an adverse judgment, a criminal matter, a government investigation, fraud. So it is much, much broader than just our practice group. And somebody like Linda can be brought in to deal with a whole host of non-financially related issues for a company.
Yeah, right. I think that's an important thing. That same process, maybe the process is shorter, maybe there's not as many stakeholders, whatever those things are, but you still have to go through whenever there's any sort of crisis. God forbid there's an explosion at a factory. There's some sort of equipment failure, and people are harmed in some way. There's food poisoning from a product. Whatever those things are, that's why it's so important when you're dealing with your clients for matters outside of bankruptcy, to really say, take the time to do this with all your other risk planning, everything else you're doing with your business. It's also important just to have, we call it a binder. There's not a physical binder as much anymore, but just having, who are my stakeholders? What lists are available? Going through this exercise once a year. What are some, holding statements depending upon the situation, so I can have them ready. God forbid there is some sort of an accident or something, or maybe someone's tampered with a product, or someone's been harmed in a manufacturing plant. Sort of having those statements ready buys you a little time when you need to be able to quickly respond. So sort of anticipating what could happen makes your internals team stronger. So when there is, if in the event that there is some sort of a situation, they can react properly. I don't know if there's any other questions.
Doesn't seem like it.
Stunned silence, Linda.
Well, thanks for again giving me this opportunity today. Oh, you do? Okay.
Having come from the client side, if you like, Linda, because I'm not an attorney, so much of what you're saying sort of kind of resonates, and having been through a couple of situations, both when I've consulted with companies going through restructuring, and been in one myself being restructured, yeah, to have had somebody come in, once I brought somebody in the UK, to work that communication properly as part of the approach. Yeah, I can't underestimate how important it is.